हिजाब क्यों नहीं पहन, तेरा उम्र नहीं है, तू अभी ऐसे क्यों घूमती है जैसे कि लगता है कि वेश्या की तरह, और तेरी माँ शेख हसीना इंडिया चले गए, तुझको क्यों नहीं लेके गए। तो मेरा बाल यहाँ से पीछे से इधर से उधर से वो कैंची उठा के मेरा बाल काटा।
It was a warm afternoon in Dhaka when chaos knocked on Tareen Afroz's door. She had been resting, exhausted after the recent upheavals in the country. The streets outside her home were filled with the remnants of protests, the echoes of chants still hanging in the air. But the noise that reached her bedroom that day wasn't just the sound of unrest. It was something far more personal, far more dangerous. A group of boys stormed her home, bursting into her bedroom like a nightmare come to life. Their eyes blazed with a mix of fervor and misguided authority. They demanded to know why Afroz, a former chief prosecutor in the War Crimes Tribunal, wasn't wearing a hijab, the traditional head covering for Muslim women. It wasn't a question. They were interrogating her. The tension in the room was suffocating as they cornered her, their zeal far exceeding their understanding of the world or the faith they claimed to defend. In a moment of horror, one of them took out clippers and, without warning, began shaving her head. The sound of the buzzing clippers filled the room, a stark contrast to the silence Afroz had found herself trapped in. It wasn't just her dignity they were taking. They were stripping her of her sense of safety, piece by piece. For days, they held her hostage in her own home. The boys, barely more than children themselves, turned to violence. They stabbed her with pencils, leaving marks on her body as if to etch their cruelty into her skin. Each stab was followed by lectures on Islam, the religion she knew well, but which these boys were using as a weapon, their version of faith twisted beyond recognition. Afroz could only think of her young daughter. Would they hurt her too? Would they dare to go further? Every hour stretched into an eternity as she feared the worst, silently praying for their release. "I thought they'd kill me," she would later say, her voice shaking with the memory of those dark days. Afroz's story was a small part of a much larger unraveling happening across Bangladesh. The country, home to the fourth largest Muslim population in the world, was teetering on the edge of a precipice. The world watched as Western and Indian officials warned of Islamist extremists gaining ground in the region, a new front in the global war on terror. The Middle East was already alight with conflict, with Israel locked in battles against Hamas and rumors of an impending invasion of Lebanon. It was a fertile time for extremists to recruit, and Bangladesh was a volatile tinderbox waiting for a spark. Only weeks before, former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina had been ousted after 15 years of increasingly authoritarian rule. In the aftermath, there had been hope, perhaps fleeting, that the country would step into a new dawn of democracy and reform. The army's decision to put Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus, the man behind microcredit for the poor, in charge of an interim government seemed to validate those hopes. But the collapse of Hasina's regime reopened old wounds, deep scars from a genocide half a century ago that had shaped Bangladesh's politics and its troubled relationship with extremism. Hasina, for all her flaws, had been a bulwark against Islamist influence in the country. She had kept the radicals at bay, much to the relief of neighboring India and Western powers. Her critics may have called her authoritarian, but she had a record of standing up to religious extremists, protecting the country from falling into the abyss that had claimed nations like Pakistan. The War of Independence in 1971, which saw as many as 3 million Bengalis killed in a brutal struggle to break free from Pakistan, had left deep divides. Many of Hasina's political rivals were linked to Islamist factions, including those responsible for atrocities during the war. But with Hasina's fall, the dam had broken. In the streets of Dhaka, lawlessness reigned. Teenagers who had once protested for democracy now directed traffic. Police stations were torched, leaving behind charred husks of what was supposed to be the country's law and order. Religious minorities, particularly Hindus, found themselves targets of violence once again, with thousands fleeing to the border, desperate for safety in India. The country's once thriving economy, built on the garment industry, was also unraveling. Factories that had made Bangladesh the world's second-largest producer of garments sat idle, their machines silent. International brands like Zara, Gap, and H&M faced supply disruptions, and the industry expected a sharp drop in sales. The specter of sectarian violence loomed large, threatening to tip the nation further into chaos.
শপথ গ্রহণ করতেছি যে আমি আইন অনুযায়ী বাংলাদেশের প্রতি অকৃত্রিম বিশ্বাস আইন অনুযায়ী যথাবিহিত আচরণ করিব।
The new government, led by Yunus, found itself overwhelmed by the weight of expectations. He had been a savior in another time, helping the poor through microloans. But now, he was tasked with something far greater, steering a fractured nation away from the brink. He faced a landscape littered with extremism, economic collapse, and a society deeply divided. Yunus was no stranger to hardship, but the political games in Dhaka were unlike anything he had ever faced before. Despite his best efforts, Yunus struggled to contain the violence that surged in the power vacuum left by Hasina's departure. Islamist groups, emboldened by the chaos, sought to fill the void. Mobs set Hindu temples ablaze, decapitated statues of secular icons, and imposed their vision of a Bangladesh rooted in fundamentalism. Afroz, her head still freshly shaven from the boy's attack, watched the country descend into madness. It reminded her of the dark days of the 1970s, the days when Bangladesh had fought for its very soul. And now, once again, that fight seemed far from over. She feared that the extremists would get what they wanted. They would erase the country's history, its flag, its anthem, everything that made Bangladesh what it was. But even in the midst of fear, Afroz held on to a sliver of hope, as fragile as it was. For if history had taught her anything, it was that Bangladesh was a nation that could rise from the ashes, no matter how deep the scars.